Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snowstorm came on so quickly that Sarah didn't have time to react. One minute, the sky was clear, the sun low in the late afternoon sky, and the next, it was as if someone had dropped a heavy white curtain over the world. The wind howled, shaking the windows of the cabin. The snowflakes were thick and heavy, so dense that she could barely see past the porch. It was January, one of the coldest winters on record, and she had come up to the cabin in the mountains for some solitude. No one had expected a storm like this. She stood by the window, her hands pressed against the cold glass, watching as the snow piled up against the door. The forecast hadn't called for anything so severe, but she knew better than to trust the weather reports. She had grown up in the mountains. Storms like this weren't uncommon. The cabin was old, rustic, and tucked away in a clearing far from any real civilization. It had belonged to her grandparents. After they passed, Sarah had inherited it, and though she loved the peace and quiet, something always unsettled her about the place. The windows creaked when the wind blew, and the floors groaned beneath her feet like they were alive, watching her. She had never admitted it to anyone, but sometimes it felt as though the house had a memory of its own, one that she couldn't shake. She grabbed her phone to call her sister Jen to tell her about the storm. No signal. Of course. Sighing, she tossed the phone aside and pulled the old woolen blanket off the couch, wrapping it around her shoulders. It was just a snowstorm, she reminded herself. Nothing to be afraid of. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had been staying at the cabin for a few days, and every night it felt colder, the shadows deeper. And then there was the sound. The sound started on the second night, a faint tapping like someone gently knocking at the door. At first, Sarah thought it was just the wind, but when she went to check, no one was there. The snow outside was untouched. The tapping returned the next night and the next. She didn't tell anyone about it, not wanting to sound crazy. Maybe it was a tree branch or an animal. But tonight was different. The tapping had turned into something more distinct, scratching, as though something was dragging its nails against the door. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. This was deliberate. Sarah hesitated, her heart beating faster now. She looked at the door, the light from the fire casting long shadows across the room. The scratching sound came again, louder this time. She got up and walked cautiously toward the door. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. The air in the cabin had grown thick, oppressive. The cold seeped into her skin, even though the fire was roaring in the hearth. She jumped back when the sound came again, a sharp grating noise, as if someone was trying to claw through the wood. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling, though she tried to sound steady. No answer. She didn't know what to do. The storm was too fierce for her to go anywhere, and the thought of staying locked inside alone seemed even worse. Sarah glanced around the room, looking for some sort of comfort, but there was nothing. The old pictures on the walls, the worn furniture, it all seemed foreign to her now. The familiar had become something unsettling. And then she remembered something she had almost forgotten. A story her grandmother used to tell her when she was a child about the house and the things that lived in the forest. There was a curse, a warning, passed down through generations. A shadow in the trees that would come for you if you stayed too long. Sarah had never really believed it. It was just a story, a bedtime tale meant to frighten children. But now, standing in the quiet cabin with the storm raging outside, she felt the weight of her grandmother's words pressing on her chest. The tapping continued, the scratching. It sounded as though it was coming from all around the cabin now, not just the door, the walls, the windows. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and moved toward the back door, her eyes darting toward the small window next to it. She couldn't help herself. She had to know. She flicked the light on and slowly approached the window. The wind had died down slightly, but the snow was still thick and falling heavily. As her flashlight swept across the yard, she froze. In the distance, barely visible through the snow, was a figure, a man. He was standing perfectly still in the clearing, facing the cabin. He was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat that blended in with the darkness of the trees behind him. His face was obscured by the shadows, but there was something about him that made Sarah's blood run cold. He wasn't moving, just staring at her. The flashlight beam flickered and the figure disappeared. Her heart was pounding now, her breath coming in quick gasps. The air in the cabin had gone deathly still. She couldn't shake the image of the man from her mind. Was he real? Or was it just the storm playing tricks on her? She bolted back to the front of the cabin, locking all the doors and windows as quickly as she could. The fire was dying down, the room growing colder by the minute. She needed to leave. She needed to call for help. But when she tried the phone again, there was still no signal. The scratching returned, louder now, more frantic. The doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. Panic surged through Sarah. She grabbed her coat and ran to the back door, desperate to escape the cabin. But as she pulled on the handle, the door wouldn't budge. It was as though something was holding it closed from the other side. Her heart raced as the scratching turned into a thudding, like something heavy was being slammed against the door. Then a voice, low, muffled, but unmistakable, called her name. Sarah. It wasn't her imagination. It wasn't the wind. The voice came again, clearer this time, and it was coming from inside the cabin. Sarah? She spun around, flashlight shaking in her hand, and saw him. The man. He was standing just inside the doorway, watching her with wide, empty eyes. His face was pale, gaunt, as though he had been dead for years. His clothes were old, tattered, his hands gnarled with age, but it was his eyes that terrified her the most. They were hollow, dark pits, like there was nothing inside him but emptiness. "Get away from me!" Sarah screamed, backing away from him. But the man didn't move. He only stood there, his eyes locked on hers, his mouth opening slowly, revealing a row of jagged, yellow teeth. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed against the door, and the man was gone. Sarah didn't wait to see if he would return. She grabbed her things, ran out the back door and into the snowstorm, not caring that she was unprepared for the brutal cold. She just had to get away. She didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house, a small cabin about a mile away. She knocked frantically on the door, shouting for help. The door opened slowly, revealing a pair of concerned eyes. "What happened?" the neighbor asked. Something's in my cabin," Sarah gasped, her body shaking. But when the neighbor went to look, there was no sign of the man. The door to Sarah's cabin stood wide open, the snow falling gently around it, as if nothing had happened at all. Sarah never returned to that cabin. She left Stillwater for good, never telling anyone about what she had seen or heard. The memories of that night, the scratching, the man in the storm, stayed with her, and every January when the snow began to fall, she would remember and wonder if the man was still waiting in the storm, watching. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The wind howled fiercely as I made my way up the snow-covered road. It was the kind of January storm that seemed to take on a life of its own, unpredictable, relentless, and cold enough to bite through to your bones. I should have turned back. My gut told me I should. But the cabin was only an hour out of town, and I needed the time alone, needed the quiet to think, to escape. I'd rented the cabin for the weekend. It was a place my family had stayed in years ago, tucked away on a remote stretch of forest land. I remembered the area fondly, those long, quiet winters spent with my parents and younger brother, enjoying the isolation, the freedom. When I found the cabin listed for rent, I felt like I had to go, like it was the universe telling me to return. I couldn't have known how wrong that decision would turn out to be. By the time I reached the cabin, the snow was falling in heavy, wet clumps, and the wind had picked up to a howl that rattled the trees. I parked the car, hoping the engine would be able to withstand the cold long enough for me to get inside and settle in. There was no sign of anyone else. The cabin was still as I remembered it, small, secluded, tucked into the woods, with its single chimney sending a thin thread of smoke into the sky. I grabbed my bag and trudged to the door, the snow knee-deep in places. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, immediately feeling the warmth of the cabin's interior wrap around me like an old friend. The space smelled faintly of pine wood and mustiness. The fire wasn't lit, but there were a few logs stacked beside the fireplace, ready to go. I set my things down, started the fire, and took a seat in one of the armchairs. The storm outside was loud, the wind screaming through the trees, but inside the cabin, it was peaceful. It didn't take long for the warmth to sink into my bones, and soon I found myself lost in the quiet, my mind wandering. It had been a tough year, losing my job, my relationship falling apart. It all seemed like too much. I'd hoped the isolation would clear my head. But as the hours passed and the storm continued to rage, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The silence, the stillness, it felt too heavy, too oppressive. It was when the storm really picked up, the winds roaring outside, that I began to hear it. At first, it was just a faint noise, a scratching sound, like something dragging across the wooden floor. I thought it was the wind, but when it continued, persistent and strange, I stood up and walked toward the hallway. The sound came from upstairs. I froze for a moment, heart thudding in my chest. It was a simple cabin with only a few rooms, one of which was the small loft upstairs. No one was supposed to be here. I was alone. So, what was making that noise? I stepped cautiously toward the staircase, my breath shallow. The air upstairs was colder, even though the fire was still burning brightly below. I stood at the base of the stairs and listened. The scratching now mixed with something else, a soft, deliberate thudding, like footsteps. I turned on my phone's flashlight and started up the stairs, every step creaking under my weight. As I reached the top, I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary, but the sensation of being watched hit me, cold and sharp. The door to the small bedroom was slightly ajar, and I could swear I saw something move in the dim light. I pushed the door open, my heart racing. The room was empty. No one was there. I felt ridiculous standing there, looking around at nothing. It was just the wind, I told myself, just the house settling. But then I saw it. On the floor near the corner of the room was a pile of dust and debris, and in the middle of it, a single perfect handprint. It was fresh, the outlines still sharp, as if someone had placed their hand there moments before. I stepped forward, heart pounding, and reached out. The dust was cold to the touch. I knew no one had been in here before. I hadn't touched that spot since I'd arrived. My skin prickled as the realization sank in. Someone or something had been here. The wind howled louder, rattling the windows, and I quickly backed out of the room, heading back down the stairs. My mind was spinning, my thoughts jumbled, but one thing was clear: I couldn't stay here. Not tonight. I moved to the front door, but as my hand reached for the handle, I felt the temperature drop. The cold seeped into my skin, into my very bones, and I couldn't breathe. It was as if the air had become thick, oppressive, like it was pressing in from all sides. I yanked the door open, but there was no one outside, only the storm, blinding, suffocating, and cold. The wind tore at me, biting through my jacket as I stood on the porch, eyes scanning the trees. There was nothing there. I slammed the door shut and leaned against it, trying to steady myself. It's just the storm, I told myself. The isolation is getting to me. I've been alone for too long. But something about the atmosphere had shifted. I could feel it in my gut, a sense of being not alone, but watched. The quiet had become unnatural, as if the storm outside and the silence inside were conspiring against me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up by the fire, trying to read, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind set my nerves on edge. At one point, I thought I saw something, just a glimpse in the reflection of the window. A shadowy figure standing in the snow. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the storm, raging like an animal outside. Around 3 a.m., the noise started again. This time, it was much louder, distinct thumping, like something large moving around the cabin. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight again and rushed to the stairs, hoping to find nothing. But when I turned on the light, the upstairs was empty. There was no one here. I checked the front door, the windows, but they were all locked tight. No one could have gotten in. The cabin was just as it had been when I arrived. Yet the noise continued, coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards, or perhaps from the walls themselves. It was low, almost like a growl, then a deep, slow thud, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my bag, rushed to the car, and sped off into the storm. The snow was thick, nearly blinding, but I couldn't stay another minute in that place. When I finally made it to a small town and found shelter, I called the rental company. The woman on the other end of the line was calm, too calm. When I mentioned the strange noises, the handprint, the figure in the window, she simply replied, "You're not the first one to experience things like that." Her voice was even. That cabin has a history. People say the place is haunted. I hung up before she could say more, my skin crawling. I didn't want to know more. I didn't want to think about what had happened. I had gotten out. That was all that mattered. I've never returned to that cabin. Every time I think about it, I remember the cold handprint on the floor and the whisper of something moving in the dark. Some places, I guess, are meant to stay forgotten. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was January of 2012 when the snowstorm hit. Rachel had never liked winter, not the icy roads or the endless white blanket that covered everything in sight. But this storm, this one was different. It had been brewing for days. The weather reports warning of an early blizzard that would last well into the night. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend for Rachel, just her and her little cabin in the woods, a break from the noise of the city, a chance to recharge. But when the storm arrived, it arrived with ferocity. The wind whipped around the trees like an animal on the hunt, sending sharp, cold flurries against the windows. The snow fell heavily, the kind that swirled in the air, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Within hours, the power went out, plunging the small cabin into darkness. Rachel wasn't concerned, at least not yet. She had candles, a wood-burning stove, and a stack of books. It was just another snowstorm, or so she thought. As the storm raged outside, Rachel settled in by the fire, reading a book her mother had given her years ago. It was quiet, the crackling of the fire the only sound. The wind moaned outside, but she found the noise oddly comforting. After a while, she began to feel sleepy, her eyelids heavy, the warmth of the fire making her drowsy. It wasn't until she heard the first knock that she snapped awake. The sound was faint, almost like a distant tapping at the door. At first, she dismissed it as the wind or perhaps a branch hitting the side of the cabin. But then the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Rachel felt a chill ripple down her spine, but she tried to push it aside. It was probably a neighbor, someone caught in the storm who had wandered off course. She stood up, making her way toward the door, her breath puffing out in little clouds as she crossed the cold cabin floor. The door was a thick wooden thing, meant to keep the winter out, but Rachel had always found it a little unnerving. The old hinges creaked when the wind pushed against them, and sometimes late at night she could hear strange sounds coming from the woods, whispers, perhaps, or something else she couldn't explain. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" Rachel called, her voice echoing through the silence. No answer. She unlocked the door, her heart suddenly racing. She wasn't sure why she felt so uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation, the fact that she hadn't seen anyone in days. But when she opened the door, there was nothing there. The snow outside was heavy, falling in thick curtains, and the wind howled as it whipped past the cabin. Rachel stepped outside, squinting into the storm, but she saw no one. The path to the cabin was buried under a fresh layer of snow, untouched by footprints. Shivering, she closed the door and locked it behind her. She stood in the living room for a moment, her mind racing. Who could have been out there? She chalked it up to her imagination, the storm playing tricks on her senses. But as she returned to the fire, the unease in her gut only grew. She felt watched, as though someone or something was waiting just outside, lurking in the shadows of the trees. Rachel shook her head, trying to push the feeling away. It was just the storm, the isolation. She needed to relax. But as she sat down, she couldn't ignore the fact that the air in the cabin seemed to be growing colder, despite the fire burning brightly in the hearth. The temperature was dropping, and the wind outside was picking up again, rattling the windows and making the walls creak under the pressure. It wasn't long before the knock came again, but this time it wasn't at the door, it was at the window. Rachel froze, her pulse thumping in her ears. The knock was soft, hesitant, as though something or someone was testing whether she would hear it. The candlelight flickered as she slowly turned toward the window. The dark shape outside was barely visible through the snow, but she could make out a figure standing just on the edge of the porch. Her throat went dry. She grabbed the flashlight, trying to steady her hands, and moved to the window. Her breath fogged up the glass as she pressed her face against it, trying to get a better look. But all she could see was the dark silhouette of a person standing motionless in the storm. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at the cabin. Rachel's chest tightened. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, to flee, but she didn't. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. After what felt like an eternity, it vanished as if swallowed by the storm. Her legs trembled as she backed away from the window, her mind racing. Who could it have been? No one lived out here. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even if someone had wandered through the storm, why hadn't they spoken? Why had they just stood there, staring? The knocking returned. This time, it came from the back of the cabin. Rachel didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone, praying for a signal, but there was nothing. The storm had knocked out all communication. The storm was the least of her problems. She could feel it now, the presence, the weight of something just behind her, lurking. With the flashlight clutched in one hand, Rachel made her way to the back door. She tried to gather her courage, but when she reached for the handle, she hesitated. Something was wrong. Something felt off, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Then, without warning, the back door flew open. Rachel screamed as the cold air blasted into the cabin. The wind tore at her clothes, the snow swirling in through the doorway. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, trying to slam the door shut, but it wouldn't budge. There was something on the other side, something pulling it open. In that moment, Rachel knew she wasn't alone. The door finally slammed shut on its own, but it was too late. She could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, like something was drawing closer. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she backed away, her flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the room, and then she saw it, the figure from outside. But this time it was inside the cabin. A man, tall and gaunt, his face pale and hollow. His eyes were black, endless pits of nothing, and his lips curled into a twisted, silent smile. He didn't move, but Rachel could feel the weight of his presence, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. It simply watched her, its eyes boring into hers, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the figure was gone. Rachel blinked, her mind racing, but when she looked around, there was no sign of the man. The cabin was silent once again. The storm outside raged on, but the weight in the air had lifted, as if whatever had been there was no longer present. But Rachel knew it wasn't over. It never was. The knocking began again, this time louder, closer, as if it were right behind her. And then, the whisper. "Rachel." The voice was unmistakable. It was the voice of the man, but it didn't come from anywhere. It was inside her head, as though the very walls of the cabin were calling to her. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, she saw him again. But this time he was not alone. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was a night like any other in January, or so I thought. The snowstorm had been raging for hours, the wind howling through the trees like a wild animal. I'd been in town for a work trip and had planned to drive back home to the city. But the storm came out of nowhere, one of those freak blizzards that can sneak up on you in the dead of winter. The roads were becoming increasingly treacherous, and soon it was clear that it was unsafe to drive. I pulled off to the side of the road when I saw a sign for a small inn about a mile ahead. It was a place I hadn't noticed before, a rustic little building nestled on a hill, barely visible through the snow. It looked like something out of a storybook, complete with a flickering light in the window. I figured I'd spend the night there, wait for the storm to pass, and head out in the morning. It seemed like a good idea at the time. When I arrived at the inn, the door creaked open as I stepped inside, the warmth of the building a relief after the freezing cold outside. The air smelled of wood and something faintly musty, like an old cabin that had been closed up for a while. A woman was standing behind the desk, a smile on her face as she greeted me. "We don't get many travelers in these parts, especially not with a storm like this. You're lucky to make it here," she said in a soft, friendly tone. I smiled back, shaking the snow from my coat. "Yeah, I wasn't planning on stopping, but the roads are too dangerous." The woman nodded knowingly, her eyes lingering for a moment before she handed me a key. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. We have a fireplace in your room to keep you warm." I thanked her and made my way up the creaky stairs to my room. The hallway was dimly lit, the floorboards groaning with each step I took. The room itself was small but cozy, with a large, four-poster bed, a fire already crackling in the hearth, and an old armchair by the window. There was something about the place that felt oddly nostalgic, though I couldn't place why. As the evening wore on, I sat by the fire, sipping a cup of tea that the innkeeper had brought up for me. The storm outside was growing more intense, the wind beating against the walls of the building. I could hear the occasional creak of the wood, the building shifting as the gusts outside shook the windows. It wasn't the most comfortable feeling, but I was too tired to care. Around midnight, I awoke to a strange sound, scratching, almost like something was tapping at the window. I opened my eyes, confused and disoriented, but when I glanced toward the window, there was nothing there. The storm had intensified, and the wind was so strong that the snow was now swirling in every direction. It wasn't surprising that the storm made strange noises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I closed my eyes again, trying to ignore the feeling of unease creeping up my spine, but then I heard it again. Scratching, tapping, only now it was coming from the door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one else in the building. The innkeeper had gone to bed hours ago. I got out of bed cautiously, moving slowly toward the door. My heart was pounding, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The door was slightly ajar, but no one was standing there. I looked down the hallway, but it was empty, just the dim light of the hallway lamp casting long shadows on the floor. I stepped back inside the room, locking the door behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just the wind, the storm playing tricks on me. I told myself I was being paranoid. But the tapping continued, faint at first, then louder. It wasn't the wind. I tried to ignore it, but the noise grew more persistent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, the kind that settles in your chest like a weight. The scratching turned into a soft, rhythmic thudding, as if something or someone was knocking. My body was frozen in place, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to move. Then I heard something else. A whisper. Low, almost inaudible, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Help me. I stood there in the darkness, my heart racing, every instinct telling me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. The whisper came again, closer this time, and I swore I could feel the presence of something in the room with me. Something cold, something unnatural. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of what was happening, but all I could see was the flickering light of the fire and the shadows cast by the storm outside. I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my phone, about to call the innkeeper, but the signal was out. No bars, no connection. I looked back toward the door, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, standing at the edge of the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the fire, but it moved, slowly, deliberately, as if it were alive, and it was staring at me. The figure was tall and thin, its outline indistinct, like a shadow made of smoke. I could make out nothing else. No face, no features. Just a tall, dark shape standing there in the corner of the room. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like lead, and I could barely breathe. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if it were drawing the very air from the room. Then the whisper came again. Please help me. It was unmistakable this time, a voice that sounded both distant and urgent. I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. All I could do was stare at the shadow, my heart racing in my chest. The figure began to move toward me, gliding across the floor like it was floating. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as terror seized me. And then, just as it was about to reach me, the door to the room slammed open with a deafening bang. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The innkeeper stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. "What are you doing? Get out of there!" I didn't need to be told twice. I ran past her, down the stairs, and out into the snowstorm without looking back. The wind whipped against my face, and I couldn't see a thing, but I ran as fast as I could. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled for the keys and started the engine, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. The drive back to town was a blur of snow and ice, my mind racing with what had just happened. I don't know how long it took me to reach the first gas station I found, but I didn't stop until I was safely inside. trembling with fear. The inn was never mentioned again. I called the innkeeper the next day, but when I asked about the place, she said it had been abandoned for years, that she had never been there, that no one else had ever stayed in that room. The storm cleared by morning, and I drove back home in silence. I've never been able to explain what happened that night, what that shadow was, or why I heard that voice. But every January, when the snowstorms begin to swirl, I can't help but think of that night, and of the figure in the shadows. Story the end.
Story number 5.
It was January, the coldest month of the year, when the storm came. Lydia had just moved to a small rural town in northern Michigan to escape the chaos of her busy life in Chicago. She found the isolation peaceful, but there were days, especially in winter, when the stillness felt oppressive. The house she rented was an old Victorian, perched at the edge of the woods, surrounded by nothing but snow-covered fields. The neighbors were far enough away that Lydia could barely make out their houses through the haze of white that stretched across the horizon. She had been living in the house for nearly a month, and though she liked the solitude, she couldn't deny that something about it unsettled her. It was as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for something to happen. Every night, after the sun set and the world turned dark and quiet, Lydia would hear the same noises, creaking floorboards, faint whispers just beyond her hearing, and the occasional knock at the door. It was never enough to make her leave, but it was enough to make her uneasy. On the evening of the storm, the air outside grew heavy and thick. Lydia sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, reading a book. The wind howled against the house, rattling the windows and shaking the old frame. Snow began to fall, light at first, but soon it turned into a fierce, relentless blizzard. Lydia wasn't concerned. She'd lived through worse storms before. She was used to the snow and cold, but even so, the howling wind outside made her feel small and vulnerable. By 9 p.m., the power went out. Lydia wasn't surprised. The house was old, the wiring was sketchy at best, and storms always seemed to knock out the power. She grabbed a flashlight and went to the kitchen to get some candles. As she passed through the hallway, she noticed something strange. The door to the basement was slightly ajar. It had been closed all day. Lydia froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't sure if she'd left it open, but she had a strong feeling that she hadn't. She hadn't gone down there since she moved in, and she certainly hadn't left the door open. For a moment, she stood there in the hallway, her breath shallow. The wind outside roared louder, and the house groaned under the pressure. Something felt wrong. She wasn't scared, not exactly, but the feeling of unease gnawed at her. Lydia approached the basement door cautiously and pushed it open further. The stairs leading down into the darkness seemed to stretch forever. Her flashlight beam danced on the stone steps, illuminating the cobwebs and dust. She hesitated, then took a step forward. Something caught her eye. At the bottom of the stairs, a shadow moved. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the dark shape, unsure whether it was something or someone. The storm outside picked up again, shaking the house so violently that the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening thud. Lydia's breath hitched. She stepped back, shaking, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the dark, was overwhelming. She didn't know what she had seen or whether it had been real, but she couldn't shake the sense that the house had something in it that didn't want to be found. The next day, the storm raged on, but the wind had died down. Lydia went about her day, cleaning, reading, and trying to push the odd events from her mind. By evening, the snow had piled up, covering everything in a blanket of white. She decided to take a walk in the woods. The silence outside was deafening, the only sound being the crunch of snow under her boots. As she walked deeper into the woods, she thought about the house and the strange feeling she had been getting lately. There were no neighbors close enough to talk to, no one to ask about the house or its history. Lydia wasn't the type to believe in ghosts, but there was something about that basement that had left her shaken. She walked for nearly an hour before she felt something, a presence, just on the edge of her perception. She stopped, her breath visible in the cold air, and listened. The woods were silent, save for the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind, But as she stood there, her skin prickling with the cold, she could have sworn she heard something. A voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It was calling her name. Lydia. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, looking around. There was no one in sight. The trees were still, the snow undisturbed, but the voice had been so clear. She could still hear it in her head, echoing, repeating her name. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and a chill ran down her spine. She spun on her heel and began walking back toward the house. Faster now, not caring about the snow or the cold. Her thoughts were racing. Had she imagined the voice? Was she losing her mind? She pushed through the woods, her footsteps growing louder in the stillness. When she reached the clearing by her house, she stopped. The front door was wide open. Lydia's stomach dropped. She hadn't left it open. She was certain of it. Her heart hammered in her chest as she made her way to the door, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling with the sensation of being watched. She paused at the threshold and glanced inside. The house was dark, the shadows long and deep in the corners. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and called out into the silence. Hello? No answer. But then, from the direction of the basement, she heard it again. A faint noise, a scratching sound, as though something or someone was moving down there. Lydia felt her blood run cold. She knew she couldn't just ignore it. If someone had gotten into her house, they were in the basement. The flashlight from the previous night was still on the kitchen counter. Lydia grabbed it, her hand shaking. She walked toward the basement door, each step feeling like a weight pressing on her chest. The door was slightly open again. She had never left it that way. Hello? She called, her voice trembling, barely above a whisper. The scratching continued, a soft, rhythmic noise. It sounded almost like nails on wood. Lydia took a deep breath and pushed the door open, her fingers white on the flashlight as she descended the stairs. The beam from the flashlight cut through the darkness. She scanned the basement, but there was nothing. No one. Just the cold stone walls and piles of old furniture covered in dust. She was about to turn and leave when something caught her eye. At the far end of the basement, against the wall, there was a large, antique mirror. Lydia hadn't noticed it before. It was framed in dark wood, ornate and ancient, with intricate carvings. But as she stared at it, she saw something in the reflection. Someone standing behind her. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The basement was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, but the scratching continued. Lydia ran up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and bolted it from the inside. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart racing. She felt like she was suffocating in the house that had suddenly become a prison. The storm howled outside, but inside, Lydia felt like she was being suffocated. She couldn't explain what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone in that house. Not anymore. And whatever was there, whatever had been watching her, wasn't going to let her leave. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The wind was howling by the time I reached the small town of Cedar Hills, tucked away in the mountains. It had been snowing for hours, and the visibility was getting worse. My headlights barely pierced the thick blanket of white that fell steadily, covering everything in sight. I had been traveling for what felt like an eternity, and the roads were becoming increasingly treacherous. The temperature had dropped so quickly that my breath froze as soon as it left my lips. I was supposed to stay in Cedar Hills for a couple of days to visit my cousin, Emily, who had recently moved to the area. But the snowstorm had delayed my arrival, and by the time I finally got close, I wasn't sure I could make it all the way to her place. The visibility was too poor, and I was exhausted from driving. I decided to stop at the only inn in town, hoping to find some shelter for the night. The place wasn't much to look at, old, with a faded sign hanging crookedly above the door, but the warm glow from the windows promised safety and rest. I pulled up to the small parking lot, grabbed my bag, and hurried inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I was immediately met with the comforting smell of wood and something faintly metallic. The lobby was small but cozy, with a crackling fire in the hearth and an old woman sitting behind the desk, knitting quietly. "Welcome," she said without looking up. Her voice was raspy, like she'd been talking to herself for years. "You must be the last one to get in. Bad storm out there, huh?" I nodded, still catching my breath from the cold. Yes, it's worse than I thought. I was hoping to get to my cousin's, but the roads are impassable. The woman gave me a sympathetic look. We're not much, but you can stay here for the night. We've got a room with a bed and a fire to keep you warm. I thanked her and took the key she offered, making my way up the narrow staircase to the second floor. The place was a bit run down, but there was something comforting about it. The kind of place you could imagine yourself growing up in, filled with family heirlooms and antiques. The smell of old wood and furniture permeated the air. When I entered my room, it was exactly as she had promised, small but warm. The bed was covered with a thick quilt, and the fire crackled softly in the fireplace. I set my bag on the small table near the window, then gazed out at the snowstorm still raging outside. It seemed as if the storm had no intention of letting up any time soon. I unpacked my things, changed into more comfortable clothes, and sat by the fire, trying to relax. But as I settled into the quiet of the room, something began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a vague unease that crept up my spine, making me hyper-aware of every creak and groan the building made. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. I shook my head, trying to ignore the growing sense of discomfort. It was probably just the isolation, the fact that I was alone in this small, unfamiliar town. And the storm outside wasn't helping my nerves either. I decided to make myself some tea, hoping the warmth would calm me down. But as I moved toward the kettle on the small counter, I heard it. A soft sound like footsteps on the floor above me. At first, I thought it was the wind. The house was old and the storm was intense. It wasn't uncommon for old buildings to make strange noises in such conditions. But this was different. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, almost like someone was walking around upstairs. I froze, listening intently. The sound stopped for a moment, then resumed. It was unmistakable now. Heavy, measured footsteps, the kind of sound you would hear if someone were pacing back and forth in the room above. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, my breath shallow. My heart started to race. I was certain I was alone. The innkeeper had said I was the only guest. But as I listened to the footsteps continue, something in my gut told me I was wrong. I grabbed the phone on the bedside table and dialed the innkeeper's number, my hands shaking as I pressed the buttons. "Hello?" she answered after a few rings, her voice crackling through the line. I just heard some footsteps upstairs," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is anyone else staying here?" There was a long pause before she responded. "No," she said, her voice low and almost absent. "You're the only one here. There's no one else in the inn." I could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating. "Are you sure?" I pressed. "Because I'm hearing someone walking around upstairs." Another long pause. "It's just the house," she said finally, almost too quickly. "The house makes noises. It's old. You're just hearing things." I didn't believe her. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. I hung up the phone, my hands still trembling. I walked cautiously over to the door and placed my ear against it, trying to listen for any more sounds. The footsteps had stopped for the moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was up there. Suddenly there was a loud bang from above, as if something had fallen to the floor. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. It was followed by a loud scraping sound, as if something was being dragged across the floor. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but I couldn't just leave the inn. I grabbed my coat, threw it on, and bolted for the stairs, my mind racing. As I reached the top of the stairs, I felt a cold gust of wind blow through the hallway. It was freezing, and the storm outside had intensified, but this was different. The temperature had dropped drastically, and I could feel it in my bones. I stepped cautiously down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards beneath my feet amplifying the eerie silence. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the building, making the air feel alive, restless. When I reached the door at the end of the hallway, I hesitated for a moment. My breath fogged up in front of me as I turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was dark, but I could just make out a figure standing by the window, facing away from me. I froze. It was a woman, or at least I assumed it was. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress, her long, dark hair flowing down her back. I couldn't make out her features, but her presence was undeniable. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could say anything, the figure turned toward me, and I saw her face. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. Her lips were cracked and blue like she hadn't been alive in years. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a raspy breath against the cold air. "Help me." The room was filled with an icy chill, and I felt a wave of nausea rush over me. I stumbled backward, nearly falling down the stairs as I fled from the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran down the hallway, out of the inn, and into the storm without a second thought. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands numb from the cold, my mind spinning with what I had just seen. The innkeeper's voice echoed in my mind. "It's just the house. You're hearing things." But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that whatever it wasn't part of the house. It was something else. I drove through the snowstorm that night, never looking back, never stopping until I reached the nearest town. I tried calling Emily, but the line was dead. She hadn't even received my messages. I never returned to Cedar Hills, and to this day, I don't know who that woman was or why she was haunting that inn. But I can still hear her voice in the back of my mind, whispering in that cold, raspy tone, "Help me." Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was January, and the storm came quickly, without warning, the way it often did in the north. Erica had lived in this little house on the edge of town for almost a year, but she had never been accustomed to the fierce winter storms that rolled in from the mountains. She had grown up in a southern city, where snow was a rare event and winter came with only a light chill. Here, it was different. The snow piled up by the foot, and the wind howled for days. Erica had planned to spend the weekend inside, finishing a book and baking cookies, her favorite way to pass the time when the weather kept her indoors. She didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she welcomed it after the stress of the last few months. The town was small, and the house, though charming, was isolated, one of the last on a long road lined with trees that seemed to stretch on forever. It felt like the world outside was a million miles away, and she liked it that way. But something was off that day. The storm had started as a light dusting, a few flakes drifting lazily from the sky, but by the time it was evening, the winds had picked up and the snow was coming down in heavy sheets. The air inside the house grew cold, despite the heater running at full blast, and Erica found herself pulling on an extra sweater. She'd lived here long enough to know that storms like this one could knock out the power. But for now, the lights were still on, and the wind outside only made the house feel cozier by comparison. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. The winds screamed through the trees, rattling the windows and sending the snow swirling into drifts. Erica had just finished her tea and was heading to bed when she heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, like a tapping, but it was distinct enough to make her pause. She stood there, her hand on the doorknob, listening intently. A minute passed. She frowned and opened the door. Nothing. The porch was blanketed in snow, and the wind whipped the snowflakes around in wild swirls. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone. She was about to close the door when it happened again. A soft tap, tap, tap. Erica's stomach clenched. She hesitated, but then stepped outside. There was no one on the porch, no trace of anyone having walked up to her house. She looked out across the snow-covered yard, seeing nothing but the white expanse of snow that stretched endlessly into the dark. The wind howled louder, but there was no sound of footsteps in the snow, no distant chatter or anything that would suggest someone had come here. The porch light flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow over everything, and Erica stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. The house was still. The fire crackled in the living room, and the silence stretched out in front of her like an endless road. But now there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before, an unease she couldn't explain. She checked the locks on all the doors and windows, all secure. She went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house seemed louder than before, each gust of wind against the walls unsettling. Her mind wandered back to the knock. Who could have been out there? It wasn't until well into the night that she heard it again. The knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She got out of bed and crept quietly to the window, looking out into the storm. The porch was empty, no footprints, no sign of anyone. But as her eyes scanned the yard, a figure appeared at the edge of the trees. A shadow. At first, she thought it was her imagination, but as she squinted into the storm, she saw it more clearly. The figure was tall, standing motionless at the tree line. Erica's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't make out any features, just the shape of a person standing there in the dark, in the storm. The figure didn't move, didn't approach. It simply stood there, facing the house. Her mind raced, but her body froze. Should she call someone? Was this someone in need of help? But as much as she wanted to move, something kept her rooted to the spot. The figure remained there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, without warning, it disappeared into the trees. Erica waited, not sure what to do. She listened, but the storm had swallowed the world around her. The knocking had stopped. She couldn't sleep after that. Her eyes darted nervously from the window to the door, back to the window. Her mind played tricks on her, filling the silence with imagined sounds. What was it? A person, lost in the storm, or something else? The next morning, the world outside was covered in thick layers of snow. The wind had died down, and the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the snow-covered landscape. Erica went outside to check for tracks, but there were none, no sign of anyone having been on her property. Confused, she told herself that it had all been a figment of her imagination. The storm had played tricks on her, and the figure, the knocks, were all just part of that. She tried to push it from her mind, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, the storm had passed, but the wind still howled outside. Erica was on edge, still haunted by what had happened the night before. When she went to bed, the silence was almost unbearable. But as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, she heard it again. The knock. But this time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. The sound was clear, distinct. Tap, tap, tap. Erica's heart raced, and she sat up in bed, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. She didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was on the other side of the window, but she knew she had to. She walked slowly toward the window, her hands trembling. She pulled back the curtain, and for a long moment there was nothing. Just the deep, cold night and the falling snow. But then she saw it. The same figure from the night before, standing at the edge of the porch, its back to her. Erica's blood ran cold. She backed away from the window, her mind spinning. Was it a person? A trick of the storm or something else? She didn't know, but as the knock came again, louder this time, she realized something. Whatever it wasn't going away. It had been waiting for her, and it wasn't leaving until it had her. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm had been relentless for hours when I found myself stranded on an isolated road, surrounded by nothing but thick white snow and dark trees. The wind howled, its icy breath whipping against my car, and the visibility was almost zero. It was a familiar feeling. A winter storm in January, the kind of weather that had always unsettled me. Still, I didn't expect anything unusual to happen on this particular trip. I had been on my way to visit my sister Sarah, who lived in a small town about 2 hours north of where I was. She had called earlier, telling me to be cautious because a storm was coming, but I didn't think it would be this bad. I didn't think the storm would trap me. After a few more miles, the GPS went out, and I could barely see the road. That's when I saw the lights of a building ahead. It wasn't much. A small cabin-style inn off the side of the road, barely visible through the falling snow. The sign was barely legible, but I saw the word "inn" at the top, and that was enough to convince me to pull in. I parked in front of the inn, took a deep breath, and grabbed my bag. As soon as I opened the door, the wind hit me like a wall. The cold was immediate, biting through my coat and forcing me to pull my collar up as I hurried inside. The warmth of the building was a welcome relief. The flickering light of a fire greeted me, and the smell of old wood and something earthy filled the air. It was cozy, albeit a little rundown, like a place that had seen better days. A woman stood behind a small counter, her white hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, but her smile was warm. "Welcome," she said softly, her voice low and soothing. "I wasn't expecting anyone in this weather. Are you all right?" "I'm okay," I replied, taking off my wet gloves. "I just need to stay for the night. The roads are too bad to keep driving." "Of course," she said, nodding. "You're welcome here. You'll be safe until the storm passes. Room 3 is open, just up the stairs. I thanked her and made my way to the room, feeling a strange unease settle in as I walked through the dimly lit hallway. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and I wondered how old this place really was. The wallpaper was peeling in places, and the walls were covered with faded pictures. Old family portraits, landscapes, and something about the way they were hung made me feel as though they were watching me. The room itself was simple, with a single bed, a small dresser, and a fireplace. I could see the storm outside from the window, the snow swirling in heavy gusts. I unpacked my things, took a long shower to shake off the cold, and sat down by the fire to warm up. It wasn't until I turned off the bathroom light that I noticed something odd. From the corner of my eye, I thought I saw a shadow move in the hallway. I blinked, expecting it to be a trick of the light, but it lingered for a moment longer before disappearing. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I opened the door to check, but there was nothing, just the dark hallway, empty and still. I felt a strange chill crawl over my skin, but I told myself it was just the storm, the wind howling through the cracks of the old building. It was nothing. I lay back on the bed, still uneasy, but exhaustion quickly overcame me. I drifted off to sleep, the sound of the wind outside lulling me into a restless slumber. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was the wind again, maybe a branch scraping against the window or the house settling, but then the footsteps became clearer, slower. They were deliberate, and they were coming from the hallway. My heart began to race. I sat up, listening intently. The steps continued, as though someone was walking back and forth outside my room. I could feel my pulse in my throat, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I didn't know what to think. The innkeeper had said I was the only guest here, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near. I stood cautiously and opened the door, hoping to see someone in the hallway, someone who could explain the noise. There was no one there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the pale light of the old bulbs above. The floorboards creaked underfoot as I stepped out, but there was no sign of anyone. I turned left, right, scanning the empty space. Nothing. I felt foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped back into the room, locking the door behind me, and sat down again. My mind raced, but I couldn't think straight. The storm raged on outside, the wind still howling, but I knew it wasn't the storm making the noise. It had been something, someone, walking outside my room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard the voice. It came from the far corner of the room, soft and almost inaudible at first. "Help me." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice was faint but clear, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate, as if she were calling out for help. The words hung in the air, chilling me to the bone. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky as I moved toward the corner of the room. There was nothing there, just the cold stone wall. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure, faint and translucent, standing just beyond the fireplace. The figure was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her hair falling in dark strands around her face. She was wearing an old-fashioned nightgown, the fabric torn and dirty, her hands outstretched as if reaching for something, or someone. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The figure didn't move, but her presence filled the room, oppressive and suffocating. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at her, my mind racing. "Help me," the voice whispered again, more urgently this time. "Please." I shook my head, trying to tear myself away from the figure, but it was like my body was frozen. The woman's eyes seemed to follow me, her expression one of anguish, as if she were trapped in some endless torment. Finally, I managed to turn and run from the room, my legs barely carrying me down the hallway. I slammed the door behind me and ran to the stairs, desperate to escape. I could hear the footsteps again, moving closer, following me as I descended the stairs. I burst into the lobby, gasping for air. The innkeeper was sitting behind the desk, knitting, just as she had been earlier. "Are you okay?" she asked, not looking up. I was panting, my heart pounding in my chest. "There's someone in the room," I said, my voice trembling. "A woman, a ghost." The innkeeper's hands stilled, and for the first time she looked up at me, her eyes narrowing. "That woman," she said quietly, "was here before you. She died in that room many years ago, during a storm, just like this one." I froze, my blood running cold. What do you mean? She was the wife of the inn's owner, the woman explained, her voice soft. He was a cruel man, and during the storm, she begged for his help, but he left her. She froze to death that night in that very room. Her spirit has never left. I stared at her, unable to comprehend what she was saying. You knew about this? Why didn't you tell me? The innkeeper sighed. No one stays long enough to ask. The storm keeps people here, and when they leave, they don't remember. I couldn't speak. The storm outside raged on, but the fear I felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the ghostly presence in that room, the voice that still echoed in my ears. I never stayed another night at the inn. The storm cleared in the morning, and I left, never looking back. But every time I see snow falling in January, I can still hear that faint whisper. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The snowstorm arrived in the dead of night, just as the weatherman had predicted. It was a violent storm, the kind that could trap people in their homes for days. The winds howled through the trees outside, and the temperature plunged, sending icy blasts of air through every crack in the old house. For Emma, it was both a welcome and a frustrating event. She had planned a quiet weekend in her cabin tucked away in the woods of northern Michigan, a place she rented every January to escape the bustle of city life. But there was something about this storm, something eerie, that made the air feel heavier than usual. Emma had always been the independent type. Growing up, her parents had always warned her not to live alone, but she loved the freedom it gave her. She enjoyed the silence that came with being on her own. It was peaceful. It was comforting. That night, as the wind screamed outside, Emma curled up with a book by the fireplace, the warm glow of the fire casting long shadows on the wooden walls. The snow piled up outside, covering the world in a thick white blanket, and everything felt isolated. No neighbors for miles, just her and the storm. The first knock came just after midnight. It was faint at first, almost as though she had imagined it. But then it came again, louder, more distinct. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed through the cabin. Nedehe and Emma's stomach tightened. Who could be out there in this weather? The storm was ferocious, and there was no way anyone could have reached the cabin without getting stuck in the snow. She set down her book and moved toward the door, unsure of what to expect. It was a heavy wooden door with a thick brass knocker, and it had a reassuring solidity about it. As she reached for the handle, the knock came once more, a sharp, urgent rap. She hesitated, her heart beginning to race. Was it someone in need of help? The idea seemed strange. No one would venture out into this kind of storm unless it was absolutely necessary. Taking a deep breath, Emma opened the door a crack, just enough to peer out. The porch was empty, the snow falling in thick, swirling sheets. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints leading up to the door. It was as if the person who had knocked had vanished into the night. She frowned, wondering if she had imagined the sound, but just as she was about to close the door, it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, she was certain the sound was real. She stepped back, her pulse quickening. She couldn't explain it, but something about the knocking unsettled her. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. There was no one there. No footprints, no movement in the snow. Nothing. Emma closed the door and locked it, still shaken. The wind outside shrieked, as though it were trying to force its way inside. She quickly turned back to the fireplace, needing something to steady her nerves. As she sat down again, the uneasy feeling lingered. The knocking had been so real, so persistent, but how could it have come from outside if no one was there? The storm continued to rage throughout the night, and Emma tried her best to ignore the feeling of dread that hung in the air. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the snow beat against the windows like something was trying to get in. She curled up on the couch, wrapping herself in a blanket, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time the wind gusted, it sounded like a whisper, and Emma found herself listening too closely, waiting for the next knock. Just as she began to doze off, she heard it again. This time, it was not at the door, but at the window beside the couch. A soft tap, tap, tap. Her heart stopped. The tapping was so quiet, almost gentle, but it sent a chill down her spine. She turned to look at the window. It was dark outside, the storm blurring everything in the yard beyond. But she could see the shape of something, a shadow moving just beyond the glass. Her breath caught in her throat. Was someone standing outside, watching her? Emma's hand shook as she reached for the curtains. She pulled them back, and there, pressed against the window, was the faintest outline of a figure. A pale face, eyes wide and unblinking, staring in at her. Emma screamed, recoiling away from the window. She stood up quickly, her legs unsteady. The figure was gone, just like that, but the marks of its presence remained in her mind. The window was still frosted over, the storm still howling outside, but she couldn't shake the image of that pale face. The tapping had stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. She rushed to the door, checking it again to make sure it was locked, though she knew it had been. The house was as secure as it could be, but the unease lingered. Hours passed and the storm finally began to subside. The howling wind turned into a low, eerie moan, and the snow outside slowed to a flurry. Emma stayed awake, listening to the shifting sounds of the house, the creaks and groans of an old building struggling against the cold. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting. The next morning, the world outside was blanketed in deep snow. The storm had passed, but Emma still felt the weight of the night on her shoulders. She went outside to check the porch to see if there was any sign of a visitor, but the snow was undisturbed. No footprints, no indication that anyone had come near the cabin. She chalked it up to the storm, to the eerie way the wind had played tricks on her mind. But as she stepped back inside, she noticed something strange. There, on the table in the hallway, was a small piece of paper. It was a simple note, written in a shaky, scrawling hand. "Don't let them in." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Who had written this? And how did it get there? She hadn't seen the note before, and there was no way anyone could have come inside without her hearing them. The windows were locked, the doors were secure. She felt the blood drain from her face as the realization hit her. Whatever had been outside, whatever had knocked at her door and stared at her through the window, it had somehow gotten into the house. Panicked, she checked every room, the basement, the attic, every closet, but there was no sign of anyone. The house was empty. Yet the note remained on the table, a grim reminder that someone had been there. Days passed, but the unease didn't leave her. Emma stayed in the cabin for another day, unsure of what to do. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent her heart racing. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched, even when she was alone. The shadows in the corners seemed to linger too long. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, its flames dancing wildly, but Emma felt nothing but cold. The storm had passed, but something remained, something that had come with it. That night, as she lay in bed, the knocking came again. This time, it was at the window. Story the end.